get started with introductions, and then we'll keep going. And as people come along for the ride, and thank you all again for being here. So my name is Erin Navarro, and my pronouns are she and her. You'll see in the chat. I also have an introduction that you're welcome to also introduce yourself with that format. And I am the Senior Coordinator of Learning and Resources here at Volunteer Alberta, and I'll be facilitating the webinar for today. I have been working and volunteering in the nonprofit space since 2015, and I was previously in a volunteer coordinator role before I found my way here to Volunteer Alberta. And so I'll be sharing a few examples of this topic throughout the conversation from my own experiences, and you are all more than welcome to also share your experiences throughout using the chat function and during the question and answer time after we are done with the slide deck. So if you're just joining, welcome to our second webinar. My name is Erin. I'll be facilitating for today. But welcome to our second webinar in our current webinar series on equity and inclusion in volunteer screening. Today, we're exploring a goals-based approach to volunteer screening, how to nourish relationships and trust in volunteer programming. So our previous webinar was volunteer rights, what volunteers and board members need to know. And our next installment in the webinar series will be welcoming newcomers to participate in volunteerism, engaging newcomers. And so everyone who is registered will be receiving a follow-up email with all of that info sent, the previous recording, this recording, registration info for the next webinar. And so you'll be receiving that as well. And all of these resources are free and on our website and on our resources page as well, if you'd like to access it that way. So what we're covering today on a goals-based approach is not a set framework. It's a draft of our experimentation with volunteer screening. And I even suspect that once this webinar series is done, that our understanding will have already evolved and changed. So ultimately, you are all the context experts in your own communities, and I am really looking forward to learning from you and hearing your thoughts on the presentation as well. So one of the things that we like to do here at Volunteer Alberta to embrace more human connection is doing a check-in question with introductions. And so you're welcome to type into the chat your name, your pronouns, the organization you're representing, and what your most amazing volunteer experience has been. Mine was with Calgary Young People's Theatre as an actor when I was a teenager. So you're welcome to share that in the chat. A few housekeeping notes. Just as we're navigating the slide deck today, we do ask that you remain muted throughout the slides portion of the presentation. You should be currently muted, so thank you so much for your cooperation. And once we go through the slides, we will stop the recording after we're done and have a conversation and question and answer time, and you're welcome to take yourself off mute at that time. Otherwise, please introduce yourself in the chat and ask any questions there. So if you do have questions or technical difficulties throughout the presentation, the slides portion, you're welcome to type into the chat. And my colleagues, Michael and Graham, will be keeping an eye out for any requests there. And if you do need to reach out about further technical difficulties, you're welcome to email screening@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. And so I've also typed that into the chat again, if you need to reach out in that way. So thank you everyone for joining again and for introducing yourselves. I will be looking at all of those awesome answers later. I'm excited to see what everyone says. So we will now move on to our land affirmation. So Volunteer Alberta's main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, specifically Amiskwaciy-Waskagan, as it is referred to by the Plains Cree peoples, among other Indigenous names, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. So our staff, board, and our work reach across treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, and we affirm that the land we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory, as well as the present-day homes of many nations, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta, which includes the Métis settlements and the 22 districts of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So since time immemorial, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have cared for these lands, and they continue to do so today. Volunteer Alberta identifies and affirms the historical and current relationships of these nations to the land as an act of reconciliation, and with the awareness that acknowledging, recognizing, or affirming these facts is a small step and it is not enough. So at Volunteer Alberta, we are committed to reflecting on, critiquing, and changing our ways of knowing, being, and doing in order to start supporting and concretely contributing to reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence in ways that we have not yet done. So I am joining you today from Treaty 7 territory. And as we talk about nourishing relationships and trust in volunteer programming today, we have the opportunity to consider the barriers that Indigenous people have faced historically and presently when it comes to exclusionary systems, policies, and volunteer programs. And as nonprofits and volunteer engaging organizations in Alberta, and in the spirit of reconciliation, we have a responsibility to consider how our organizations can contribute to inclusive, accessible, and equitable volunteer programming. So again, if you're just joining, my name is Erin. I'll be facilitating the webinar for today. Thank you so much for being here. And a note on the volunteer screening program, which this presentation, this webinar is being presented to you through. The Volunteer Screening Program, or VSP, is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the Government of Alberta. And we provide educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofit voluntary sector organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. We also offer financial opportunities to aid organizations in their volunteer screening efforts, including the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver and Volunteer Screening Development Grants. So you're always welcome to reach out or check out our website if you'd like to learn more about VSP. But please note that Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. So this webinar and our resources will provide some useful and general information, but any concerns specific to your organization and work you should bring to a legal professional. So when we say volunteer screening or just screening, we are very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and organizations. So screening is a very big topic that encompasses a lot of subtopics, such as what we're talking about today. But all of these topics collectively aim to improve the quality and the safety of the programs and services in our communities. So, okay, we're still on track. So Volunteer Alberta is coming to understand more about when it comes to volunteer screening. Organizations usually approach it from one of two mental models. The first that you can see here is that organizations may see screening as a procedure that can be achieved through a checkbox list of activities. However, the alternative view and what we're advocating for here today is organizations understanding that screening is an opportunity to create and nourish relationships with volunteers right from the very start. But we'll be unpacking what that means a bit more over the next few slides. So back to mental model number one, screening as procedure. A procedural approach to screening would be considering it as a step-by-step checking off the list, less holistic process that is very clear and meant to achieve a predetermined outcome. So procedure assumes that there's this established way of doing things, and although all of us will have some sort of procedures that work, some of us may also have trouble with retaining volunteers, for example, and may not have noticed as well that the screening procedures that are currently there have some gaps that can lead to things like low retention. So it's like following a recipe to bake a cake, for example. To bake a cake, you need to follow a precise order in a specific way with particular ingredients. And while that approach works really well to bake a cake, there are some limitations to this approach when you're working with people because we're much more complex than a cake, and relationships are a lot more intricate and nuanced. So the reason some of these practices may not be working is because a procedural approach to volunteer screening can lead to a one-size-fits-all mindset that can be a bit more rigid. And this also means that you may be doing steps that may be unnecessary for lower risk roles, and there may be steps that could be missing from other roles, which may lead to unsafe or unsustainable volunteer programming. And the volunteer screening process should be adapted to the organization it is being used for. So although the screening process can be similar between organizations, the types of volunteers who are engaged at each individual organization and the structure of the organization itself, as well as the breadth of the volunteer screening process, ensures that no two volunteer screening programs will ever be exactly the same. So the 10 steps to screening is a foundational tool for screening volunteers, and it is built to be flexible to the needs of the people using it. However, it's never meant to be a prescriptive document where we copy and paste it. So one of the questions that we're asking here at VA is, what if we looked at the process of volunteer screening from the perspective of its goals instead of its steps? So some of the research VA conducted in 2022 during our Changing the Conversation report shows that a majority of organizations have a common understanding that screening is at least about promoting community safety, with many people also saying that it's about matching volunteers to roles that suit them. So we could use this to understand the purpose of volunteer screening to tap into a better framework of the 10 steps. One that doesn't just explain the what of volunteer screening, like what does it look like, what do we do, but it also explains why we do each step that we choose to do. So relationship-based screening, if you've been at any of our other previous webinars, you've heard me talk about this pretty much every single time, but it is the larger framework that has shaped this presentation and has shaped a lot of my thinking and our thinking here at VA. So the way that we're defining relationship-based screening as of right now is screening practices that emphasize human connection, empathy, and mutual understanding. So relationship-based screening goes beyond collecting personal documents, as it welcomes volunteers to participate and be equal players in the volunteer screening process, while organizations create safe and meaningful volunteer programming to promote volunteerism. So relationship-based screening is the foundational goal for volunteer screening. The key phrase in this definition here is safe and meaningful volunteer programming. And so there are potentially endless ways to get to this point, which can make it feel quite overwhelming. Starting or reviewing a volunteer program that you're already working with. But how we get there, how we make it to safe and meaningful is going to be just as important as where we wind up. So that's why these volunteer programs that we work within must be warm, welcoming, and with an emphasis on empathy and connection. So with this framework as our guide, that also means that you can work with your community to make a unique and contextualized volunteer program that reflects their needs. So how your organization and how the people within it embody and create the space for mutuality, reciprocity, and belonging is going to be foundational. And it's going to be just as important as where we want to go, as where we want to get to, which is safe and meaningful. But how we make it there, just as important. So a bit of context to the 10 steps. So despite the fact that the 10 steps to screening are absolutely meant to be flexible, VA still regularly hears that organizations describe the volunteer screening process as a few key hiring procedures, such as interviews, reference checks, and background checks. But the vision of the 10 steps to screening is a holistic, multi-step process, which is much more than just hiring. But sometimes there's also a gap between the steps and then screening in practice as it unfolds in our organizations. But for today, some of the how we've divided this 10 steps to screening is we can look at it in three kind of sections. There's the planning stages of the 10 steps, which include risk assessments, position assignment, and recruitment. Then there's the hiring part, if we want to look at it in this framework, which includes application forms, interviews, references, and background checks, which are listed in the original 10 steps as optional. And then there's the onboarding and retaining. So orientation and training would be included, support and supervision, follow-up and feedback. So it can be divided into three kind of subsections. So we have started to shift our understanding around screening from there being 10 steps to there being various goals of screening that the steps can help organizations achieve. And some of those questions that we're asking ourselves is, what does a deeper understanding of the 10 steps look like? And how can we understand the wisdom of the 10 steps from this goals-based lens? So screening has traditionally been seen as a sequenced, predictable, and neat machine with logical steps that lead to logical outcomes. But from our experimentation, again, this is just a framework, what we're exploring here today. But from what we're seeing and learning and experimenting with here at VA, volunteerism isn't a machine. And it's much more like a garden that needs tending to, that is much more interconnected and like an alive organism. So with gardens, we water at different seasons, we plant at different times, and we harvest when it is ready. But all of those parts of tending to a garden isn't always going to be a step-by-step, neat and tidy process. Rather, there's much more of a dynamic relationship that the gardener, quote unquote, needs to have with the garden to be attentive to its rhythms, like how it's doing, if it needs more water, if it needs to be tilled, if it needs more sunlight, etc. And so we will go through what those possible actions to caring for the garden of your volunteer program could look like. But again, it's not going to be the same for everyone because we're all working in our unique contexts and communities. So screening, it can be viewed as a linear step-by-step process where one action logically follows the other. But as I've heard and experienced, volunteering has seen a decline in many organizations, and I'm sure many of you here resonate with struggling to recruit and retain volunteers. And so the 10 steps, again, they each have their own wisdom, but approaching volunteer programming as a predictable machine may no longer be working. And so what I've also heard in some community conversations is that some volunteer managers and coordinators and specialists feel like they're doing something wrong. However, I really don't think that's the case. Rather, it's these older models that are no longer working. And so it's perhaps time to explore and experiment with another way of doing volunteer programming, hence this exploration of what a goals-based approach could look like. So screening from a goals-based perspective, however, is going to be much more nuanced, interconnected, and each goal is going to be complementary. Screening like this is much more like a garden or like an ecosystem where, yes, you can look at all the individual parts or the plants, but each element or part of it is going to be part of a larger and much greater system. So I just want to say too, that if you're looking at this and it seems really overwhelming, I totally get that. And it can feel like a massive undertaking to review a volunteer program. But just like a garden, it takes time and care to see these things bloom after they've been planted and so on. And just like a garden, we can only do so much at once, like planting the seeds or just focusing on watering or pulling a few weeds. So I totally get that if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but we'll keep talking about what this could look like. So knowing what we know about the mindset shifts, and so we're all a bit more on the same page, rather than viewing screening as a linear process, the step-by-step process, part of the shift in thinking today is viewing volunteer programming as a much more interrelated, dynamic, living and breathing system that doesn't have one set form. So that circular form is just one idea of what that could look like. And again, myself, nor VA, is an expert on what this shape could ultimately take for each organization. You are all the context experts in your own communities as to what form volunteer screening could potentially take. So screening from a goals-based perspective is going to be much more symbiotic and dynamic of a process than going through steps 1 through 10. It's much more holistic in this way. And again, there's no specific starting place or shape that it must take. This is just one representation of that form. And at the center is relationship. So relationship building may seem like it takes more time, but I really find that it helps in the sustainability of the program where volunteers want to stay and they also trust your organization enough to bring their loved ones along, helping with that recruitment piece. And most importantly, that people are able to find belonging in a mutually beneficial and welcoming organization, most important. So all of these 5 goals are centered around relationship-based screening. And remember, relationship-based screening is that main goal, it's that foundation. So safety and meaningful volunteering has to be, again, this starting point, this foundation of our volunteer programs, established through connection, trust, and empathy. But all of the other smaller goals that we see here are going to be much more interrelated, and they will build upon that foundation of relationship. So in this mental model that you see here, it also means that there isn't necessarily a step-by-step process that we can follow. Rather, it's a much more holistic approach to the many facets of a volunteer program. And so perhaps the better question to ask isn't, are we getting all the 10 steps checked, or are we getting all the steps checked for our volunteer program? Rather, it should or could be, is our volunteer program built in a way that each aspect reflects safety, trust building, and meaningful engagement with volunteers using the processes that are available to us? So with these goals in mind, and with the larger framework of relationship-based screening guiding us, all of the 10 steps are ones that you can include or not include, but all of them are options to help you create safe volunteer programming with volunteers that love the roles they're in, and that's the hope. So the process of building a relationship-based screening program becomes much more like a mix and match process that makes sense for your community. So that's a whole lot of information. So we're going to pause and do a poll. Oh, oh, that might not work on our end for some reason. Okay, that's okay. So maybe we can all just type into the chat. Question 1, how many subsections can the 10 steps be divided into? A, 2 sections, B, 3 sections, or C, 5 sections? And question 2, community safety is one of the reasons we screen volunteers, true or false? So I'll just give you a second if you want to answer those questions. So question 1, how many subsections that we talked about can the 10 steps be divided into? And then, yeah, is community safety one of the reasons we screen volunteers, true or false? So I'll give you a second just to see.
Aaron, I just relaunched the poll.
Oh, you did. Okay, thank you so much, Craig.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll let you do that, Graham, and let us know. Then just let me know when everyone is wrapping up, and then we can see what the answers are.
Responses are starting to slow down now a little bit.
Okay.
And right now we've got most people saying 3 is the option for question 1, and with about a third of the people saying 5.
Okay.
And then for question 2, almost everybody, about 98% of people said true.
Awesome. Well, good job, everyone. So yeah, for question 1, the subsections can be divided into 3 subsections for the 10 steps. And question 2, community safety is one of the reasons we screen volunteers. That is true. So good job, everyone. And with that, we'll keep moving along our slides. Sorry about the technical difficulty, but thank you everyone for being flexible, and we will keep going. And now we get to go into each of our 10 steps. So one of the first things that you can do if you don't know where to start, and I recommend that this is something that's beyond step 1, but it should be much more holistic and something we always come back to, but great place to start if you don't know where. And whether you're planning on doing a review of a volunteer program or you've just added a new position, you can do a risk assessment. Step number 1. So now, of course, if you already have volunteers in a role, you can and should be doing, again, continuous risk assessments to ensure community safety. But the goal that we've identified, the wisdom from step 1 that we've identified here, is to collaboratively identify risks and opportunities to engage volunteers in safe and meaningful ways. There's that phrase again. It will just keep coming back. So some of the best people to recognize where there are risks in the role are the ones who are completing those tasks. So in the hope of creating community safety, involving community members like volunteers and program participants can help you to achieve engaging volunteers in safe and meaningful ways. So involving them in that process of risk assessment. And as you'll see in many of these goals that we've laid out within the 10 steps, reflects relationship-based screening. So where volunteers are welcomed in relationship-based screening, where volunteers are welcomed as equal participants in creating and shaping the volunteer program. So we do have a free tool at VA called the Risk Assessment Matrix. I'll be, again, sending that out in the follow-up email to all the registered participants. That's where you can look and find a good measurement of the risks in a role. But you'll also see in the upcoming steps that some of the 10 steps may not be necessary for your organization or every single role that you have. But a risk assessment, again, is going to be really necessary if we're wanting to establish that safety, to kind of scan the horizons for what risks could be present for the community. And so I really don't recommend skipping this step. And even looking at it as a step is sometimes a bit limiting because it's a much more holistic process of doing a risk assessment. Now, how that looks in practice and specifically for you can be very different compared to another organization, but again, it should be done. VSP does have a previous webinar, again, I'll send that out, called Developing Policy and Managing Risk. That is free to access, and I will send that to all of you who are registered. So step number 2, position assignment. This is the step where you would start crafting and writing some roles. However, the goals here is twofold. So it is to, 1, gain a greater understanding of the volunteer role and responsibilities through collaborating with community members, and 2, to co-create positions that contribute to safety and meaningful engagement for the community. Now, it is important that you are doing your due diligence to account for what risks could be there and to make room for feedback from the volunteer. So it's not just one of you doing the risk assessment, but it's a conversation. And position assignment is a great example of why it's important to embrace this mindset shift, just because there are limitations to moving through steps in a linear fashion. If somebody enters a role and identifies a new risk, then you have to do a risk assessment again. So instead, you might want to try co-creating the position while also reviewing the risks as you write a job description, for example, because then you're meeting both the goal of the risk assessment and the position assignment at the same time, and building off of that relationship-based screening framework that we talked about. One thing that I also find with assigning positions too is that you may always be assigning and reassigning roles. So for example, a volunteer may try something and find that it's not their thing, and because they're not comfortable with some of the risks, for example. And so in that case, reassigning until they find a role that they feel reflects their gifts and their strengths, that might be a continuous process that could take some time, and a lot of coming back to and seeing if this works or that could work. But the key here, though, is a collaborative approach where the volunteer is included in this process of finding a good match for themselves. So step 2, position assignment, and step 3, recruitment, are also interconnected and dynamic, because when you're recruiting for these roles, hopefully there's some collaboration to find a role that works for the volunteer, and one that they love. So that's why we want to create positions that can be flexible so volunteers can engage in the role meaningfully. So as you'll keep seeing, these steps are hard to be broken into a distinct step-by-step process when looked at through the goals-based lens, because as with all relationships, it is much more dynamic and much more interrelated. But since the goal is to matchmake the volunteer with a meaningful role and then welcome them to the organization, this could also be done while you're creating the role, where it's collaboratively written by you and the people who will be doing those tasks, or while you're reviewing the role or rewriting the role or adjusting the role. again, there's much more flexibility with this being the main goal. The goal with the application form, step number 4, is to gain a deeper understanding of the volunteer, their motivations, their aspirations, skills, availability, while also finding a path forward to engagement. So getting to hear more about the volunteer can absolutely help with more ease in matchmaking them to a role they love, while also ensuring safety. For example, asking about allergies or tasks they don't feel comfortable about, as well as having their emergency contacts. All of those can help establish safer volunteer programming. And you can also ask how you and your team can help them feel like they belong at your organization. But again, if our larger framework and goal is relationship-based screening, which is safety and meaningful engagement through connection and trust, there are many different types of formats we can create for an application form. There's no best one way to do an application form. So step number 5, interviews. Although the goal is very similar to application forms, this step emphasizes trust building and relationship, although it also entails collecting practical information, like the application. So the goal with interviews, though, is to continue cultivating trust and nourish relationships by gaining a deeper understanding of each other. So not every volunteer role is necessarily going to need an interview if the overall volunteer program is, again, committed to relationship-based screening where it's much more flexible. But that means that there should be opportunities to at least cultivate trust throughout the volunteer's experience, such as gaining feedback. And that we'll get into that at step number 10. However, an interview is often going to be necessary. When you conduct an interview, remember that this is a wonderful time to form that relationship with a volunteer and to hear more about what the volunteer is interested in and draws them to your organization's vision and mission. So you could ask questions like, can you give me an example of a time when you felt a sense of pride when you were volunteering or working? And what do you think we could do here to help you feel a sense of pride in your contribution with us? So remember, establishing that foundation of trust means that when volunteers engage in their roles, they'll likely feel a lot more comfortable to offer feedback and suggestions so that you can continue to improve upon and offer safe and meaningful volunteer programming. You could also think of ways to encourage the volunteer to ask questions of you within the interview and while they're on the job and completing their tasks. But the interview, along with some of the other steps, are opportunities just to learn more about each other and the people that you and the volunteer will be working with. So steps 6 and 7, references and background checks, have the same goal: to increase safety for community members by managing risk, which also includes managing risk for the volunteer, but also to continue to cultivate trust. Now, if one of the overall goals is safety, again, in relationship-based screening, and why we screen at all, there's many ways to manage risk, and it should be interlaced through many of the different steps to screening, like how the risk assessment is. So for example, in an interview or an application, asking if they have any previous experience doing the same tasks in the volunteer role and asking then follow-up questions can help to mitigate risk. But with things like references and background checks too, these steps to screening can also prevent people from volunteering, as not everyone has a network that they can call upon to be a reference. So I've mentioned in previous webinars as well that background checks can also be a barrier to volunteering, especially for equity deserving groups where there isn't trust towards law enforcement, or if you're new to the country, you may not be able to access a background check, or some volunteers don't want to, among other reasons as well. So if something, and please note too, if something does show up in a background check, it's really important to remember that that is only a snapshot in time. And sometimes the info that does show up isn't even going to be necessary for risk management, and it can be very hard to decipher as well. So all that to say, there are many ways to manage risk, and these steps are just 2 of the possible ways. So gaining references and background checks, these are traditionally understood forms of risk management. And because many people expect organizations to screen other volunteers that they'll be working with, it can help volunteers feel safe amongst their peers. So in that way, it can help build trust and establishes that the organization is taking measures for safety and to fulfill duty of care. So like I said, there's many different ways to manage risk, just as there are many ways and combinations of the 10 steps to do relationship-based screening. But part of what you may be picking up on and have experienced also in practice is that we can't do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, and so on, and then just keep moving forward. Screening is going to be much more dynamic and interrelated. So looking at step number 8, step number 8, 9, and 10, the goal for orientation and training, support and supervision, and follow-up and feedback is to deepen relationship building and sense of belonging while also ensuring safe programming for the community. And that can be reflected in all of these steps. So for step 8, orientation and training, I would suggest that everyone needs some sort of orientation and ongoing orientation and onboarding, just so that the volunteer knows the story of your organization and why their tasks are important to achieving the mission, to achieving the vision, and so that they know they are welcome at your organization and what they're doing does matter to what you're hoping to achieve. So those routines that you create for orientation could look like 15 minutes before the start of their shift, just running them through a couple things, doing a check-in with them. It could look like a phone call follow-up after their shift. It could be during a more formal training. It could look like a welcome letter from the executive director or the staff. It could be doing a check-in question like what we did here at the beginning. And it could be a regular survey at certain times of the year or after the first 3 shifts, but it's just a really great time to continue getting to know the volunteer and welcoming them into the organization, the mission and vision, and also learning what resonates with them and to build that trust so they know they are safe and they know they're supported in their role. There are many inexpensive ways to deepen relationships and sense of belonging through things like what we just mentioned and those little routines that we create for orientation. So when it comes to training, it doesn't necessarily need to be a whole separate day or afternoon or evening, as some roles will just need on-the-job training because it's not a very complex or high-risk role. So if a volunteer or group of volunteers does need training, it's important that, again, it makes sense for the volunteers and that it's flexible, that it's accessible, and it's related to the work they're passionate about and will be doing. So training is an excellent time to create that connection with the volunteers and to have the volunteers connect with each other and for other staff to engage them as well, especially if other staff members are going to be supervising them and working with them. And same with support and supervision. Some volunteer roles might need more supervision just to make sure it's safe for everyone, while others won't need as much. And especially while a volunteer is new to a role, it's a great time to offer your support to the volunteer and of course ongoing support as they continue with their role. It's so that the job they're doing is safe, but that the volunteer also feels safe in the role because they know who they can turn to for help. Hence the continued relationship building. So for follow-up and feedback, although it is step number 10, I would suggest it's going to be a much more holistic process in practice. So again, there are many ways to ask for feedback, but one way that would be good practice for everyone to consider is just being available through email or phone calls or meetings so volunteers can offer their feedback. So make sure they know who they can contact and how they can contact you. Something like that could be stated during an orientation. It's important too that the volunteer has some sort of relationship with you or their supervisor so that they do feel comfortable enough to ask questions and to report their concerns. And especially when it comes to safety, they should always be able to offer that feedback. But it does require that there is some level of trust so that they know their concerns will be taken seriously and that their voice is important to you and to the organization. So what I also hope to lay out here is that there are multiple combinations to screening that you can take to achieve some of the same goals. So sometimes a volunteer doesn't need a whole separate training session to do their role, and rather supervision while they fulfill their tasks on the job instead would meet this goal of continued relationship building, belonging, and safety. So in fact, in some cases, having a whole separate training or orientation night could prevent people from volunteering and from engaging because they don't have time or energy or childcare, or they have to give up a shift at work. So there's many different ways to meet these goals. So back to our graphic that we saw before, there are many different smaller goals of the 10 steps that we just went through. But some of the common themes that we see throughout are understanding risk and policy, starting over on the left side here. And it could look like reading your insurance policy or writing a volunteer handbook that is distributed to volunteers. But again, it's not just step one that we're done understanding risk and policy. There's always a possibility that new risks present themselves or that somebody else identifies a risk who's new to the role. So there's an opportunity to always be looking to do that risk assessment. Matching a volunteer to a role they love, which can be an ongoing process when it comes to assigning them to a position that reflects their gifts. Establishing mutual understanding about the volunteer's expectations. And this could, for example, it could look like distributing fulsome job descriptions so that everyone knows what's expected of them. Relationship and trust building is a common theme that we saw throughout as well. And this could look like doing the regular check-ins and reassigning to a new role or adjusting their role to something that, again, reflects their strengths. And then we also saw collecting practical information, like doing an application form or interview, knowing allergies, what they're comfortable with, what they're uncomfortable with, and so on. So again, this is just one framework that we're exploring right now, one that is hopefully going to resonate in some way. But again, this foundation of relationship is really important for understanding that as our starting point. So I understand too, if relationship-based screening is still going to be confusing, and especially the unlimited amount of possibilities can feel very overwhelming. And I've been there and I know how overwhelming that can feel. So I've included some examples of how this has worked in practice for me. Starting with references, and full disclaimer, I'm very biased against references because I just didn't find it to be a very good use of my time. And so I found that when I was volunteer coordinating, that references were just not a priority for me. And because other steps of screening, like background checks, really thoughtful and engaging interviews, or constant follow-up and constant training, references just weren't something that we had time for or found to be a priority, especially because that goal of references was met in other ways. So my thinking was that if I used the time I did have to create really thoughtful interview questions, to do phone call follow-ups after volunteers' shifts, and to provide ample supervision for the volunteers in their roles, all of these helped support relationship and trust building, not talking to someone else who wasn't a volunteer. So that was part of how I went about creating safer volunteer programming. And ultimately, it led to closer relationships with volunteers too, because instead of calling their references, the time was spent having conversation with the volunteers who were engaged at the organization. Another example on how you could do a flexible approach that reflects relationship-based screening is you could do an interview when you meet someone. But for example, there's this fundraising event that I was helping with. It was low risk, so volunteers were welcome to bring friends and family to volunteer with them, which is good practice, by the way, with recruitment. So the already engaged volunteers are doing the recruiting for you. They trust you, they know that they can bring their loved ones along. But some of the friends and family were interested in doing more volunteering later. And after chatting with them and getting to hear more about what they were interested in while we were at the event, I decided that doing another more formal interview, it wasn't necessary. And to me, the biggest part of interviews was making a connection with the volunteer through learning about what they were interested in. So we had applications that collected other important pieces of info, but there was no need to do the interview as a whole separate step. So those volunteers that myself and other team members were able to connect with, they didn't need to book a separate interview because the goal was already met. Start to build trust and relationship. and it freed up some of my time as well. So that's always a bonus. So again, this presentation today was presented through the volunteer screening program. And so we do have some other ways to support you through the vulnerable sector check fee waiver, other resources we have, and the screening development grants. You're welcome to check out our page on our website. And you're also invited to our upcoming webinar, the last webinar in our series. I can't believe it. Welcoming newcomers to participate in volunteerism, engaging newcomers. So here you can learn why newcomers engage in volunteering, understanding what inspires them, and how organizations can craft opportunities that align with their unique goals. So you can join us for a conversation with Immigrant Services Calgary as they share strategies on supporting newcomers and creating meaningful connections through volunteer screening. It is a free webinar on Tuesday, March 19th at 11 a.m. to 12:15. And National Volunteer Week enhancement funding applications are also open. So you can apply now for a grant to support your organization's celebrations, and the deadline for the grant applications to apply is March 18th, 2024 at 12 p.m. noontime MST. And next week, VSP is also offering Do I Need a Vulnerable Sector Check webinar, which is a short version of a webinar. So it'll be 30 minutes, lots of info, but this is where we share the essentials about vulnerable sector checks and review good practices for volunteer screening. So if you have some outstanding questions about, I don't know if we need a vulnerable sector check, this would be a great webinar that you're more than welcome to join. Again, it's free. And if you were at this presentation in September, it's the same content again. But of course, you're welcome to join again if you'd like. And there will be time for questions and answers in that one as well. So the volunteer screening program offers free coaching to nonprofits in Alberta who are interested in learning more about volunteer screening, or if you'd like to continue the conversation we've had today, you're also always welcome to get in contact with us. You can also access our resources from our resource library through our website as well. And all registered participants today will be receiving this presentation recording and all mentioned resources in follow-up email this week. There will also be in that email a follow-up survey that we would love and appreciate if you can take the time to share your feedback. Thank you so much to everyone who was able to share their feedback in the initial survey that I sent out. So thank you so much for that. And that is the conclusion of our slide deck for today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. If you need to head out, that's totally fine. Thank you so much for being here, but I'll stop the recording and we can move to our question and answer time.